late, tired, and I promise not to keep you for more than 45 minutes. But the main point of this is actually, it's one of the few times I feel lost for words and not too sure what to say, because the only reason I'm here is to honor Jim. I feel extraordinarily privileged to have been engaged with him on the work that we've done together with many others, some of whom you've heard throughout the day. It was an extraordinary experience, and I realized a little earlier today that even though I wasn't a student or a postdoc of Jim, I've learned an enormous amount from him. The little teeny bit of biology I know, I've learned from him and some of the help of the other young people around us. But I did also realize, and I may be wrong with this, Jim, I have probably talked science with you more than any other person in your life or my life, because we started our collaboration, Brian reminded us earlier, in 1995, and we met pretty regularly once a week on a Friday morning from anywhere from 3 to 4 to 6 hours, and it went on for 15 years. It's gone into a little hiatus, which I hope will, and just in the last couple of years, but I hope will be resurrected in a more ongoing state during Jim's retirement. But but I suspect that outnumbers the hours that you spent with anyone else, and certainly I have with my physics colleagues. I come out of physics. When I met Jim, I was running high energy physics at Los Alamos, but not only the theory, but also actually the experiment. And the commitment that I made and the commitment that Jim made, who was running his lab, I think was extraordinary. Brian made a commitment too, but he was just a student, easier. And this certainly changed the last part of my life completely, and has been one of the great experiences of my life, equal to almost anything that I've done, and I'm deeply grateful. And I feel quite emotional almost about it, I would say. It's been absolutely extraordinary. And one of the things that came up today that was crucial in this was, and you heard it, is that Jim is a big thinker. Jim is passionate about science, he's passionate about ideas, he's passionate about dialoguing about them and being a little more speculative, taking a little more risk in thinking. And therefore he's more like a physicist. And indeed, that's the segue into why I titled this talk. Let's see. One of the ongoing, both explicit and implicit conversations that took place, especially when it was just Brian, myself, and Jim, was really the differences in culture and ways of approaching science between biology and physics. And one thing I learned in that is what I said a little bit facetiously a moment ago. Jim thinks, from my viewpoint, like a physicist, and I'm going to say several provocative things in this, whereas one of the things I sadly discovered as I became more and more ingrained in biology is that Jim is an exception. I hate to say it, but that's what I learned. So what I thought I would do for this, for part of this, is to talk a little bit about biology and physics. And it's going to come across a little bit provocative and a little bit arrogant. But these are the people that, at least the ones that I interacted mostly with, this motley crew of people, and it's vaguely in chronological order, and they're all extraordinary in their own way, but Jim is more extraordinary than the rest of them, and I'm sorry, guys. Now, at the time I was kind of beginning to enter into this collaboration, it was a very special time, and one of the reasons, unconsciously, was that I was involved in something called the superconducting supercollider, and it got trashed eventually. I don't know what it was, a big accelerator being built in Texas. Excuse me. And one of the things we kept hearing as physicists was physics was the science of the 19th and 20th centuries, and biology is the science of the 21st century. And very smart people, or at least smart people, said that. There we are. E.O. Ed Wilson says, move over, physics, it's biology's century. Craig Venter, some comments down here. If the 20th century was the century of physics, the 21st century would be the century of biology. This is an article he wrote. Here's a slight counter, Financial Times. It is clear now that the 21st century bioscience has not delivered clinical and other results as quickly as some optimists or hype merchants had expected. Medicine and healthcare have changed little over the decade, while the physics-based information technology industries have transformed people's lives. So those smart people were thinking about the century of biology, but really smart people, this is what they realized. So this is a very smart person was asked this, and this is what he answered, which I believe. And this very, very smart person is an icon of reductionistic thinking. Who is this person? It's Stephen Hawking. He said that. But another person said something similar that relates to some of the things that we're going to say. And he said this: biological research is in a crisis. Technology gives us the tools, blah, 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 to analyze organisms at little scales. We're drowning in a sea of data and thirsting for some theoretical framework from which to understand it. Although many believe more is better, history tells us that least is best. We need theory, which I interpret, of course, as physics, and a firm grasp of the nature of the objects we study to predict it. Who said that? A biologist said that. Sidney Brennan. This came out just a couple of months ago. So these are two very smart people. And here's another very smart person, as distinct from just the smart people who thought it was the century of biology. It is the century of biology, but it's the century of biology meaning that you have to embrace something much bigger, and that bigger could be under the umbrella of complexity, but it means taking on somehow a bigger view of what you mean by science and explanation. And this was already said 100 years ago by another extraordinarily smart person. And he begins the famous book by saying, of the chemistry of his day and generation, I'm sorry, this is the best I could find in terms of, but you can probably read it. Of the chemistry of his day and generation, Kant declared that it was a science, lowercase s, not a science, capital S, the German eine Wissenschaft, a science of a nicht Wissenschaft, not science, for that the criterion of true science lay in its relation to mathematics. And then Thomson goes on to say, Darcy Thompson goes on to say, that's the state of biology that he describes that in 1912. To some extent, that's the state of biology in 2012. And he goes on to say, which I love this paragraph actually, even though it's a little bit weird. How far even then mathematics will suffice to describe and physics to explain the fabric of the body no man can foresee. It may be that all the laws of energy and all the properties of matter and all the chemistry of all the colloids are as powerless to explain the body as they are impotent to comprehend the soul. For my part, I think it is not so. Blah, blah, blah. And then he says, consciousness is not explained to my comprehension by all the nerve paths and neurons of a physiologist, nor do I ask of physics how goodness shines in one man's face and evil portrays itself in another, but of the construction and growth and working of the body, as of all else that is of the earthy, physical sciences is, in my humble opinion, our only teacher and guide. So this was the kind of conversations, implicitly and explicitly, that we discussed in terms of the relationship between physics and biology and the kinds of work that we did. And I just want to say a few words, kind of, I don't know, high school, freshman physics, philosophy of science, of physics, because physics deals with simplicity. almost by definition. And this is a classic example. Why is it simple? It's because we just write down those two equations and we can understand the whole solar system, and every iPhone in your pocket works because of those two equations, coupled with these equations. That's it. Everything. In fact, everything around us almost can be described by these in terms of physics. It's kind of extraordinary. But it's a highly reductionistic way of thinking about it, but it has extraordinary power, as illustrated here. If you ask what is the strength of the magnet of the electron, here's the theory predicted to 12 decimal places. That's parts per trillion. And here's the experiment. It's kind of extraordinary. Well, that's a wonderful paradigm, and I'm going to miss this out. But it's a misleading paradigm, obviously, if you take that naively over to biology, obviously. And partly it's to do with scale, because even though those equations describe this solar system in the usual way we think about it, it only describes it at a certain scale. Because if we look at a scale where we see this structure on the Earth, so that actually what we see are things like this as part of the solar system, or this as part of that system, then those equations no longer, of course, are applicable, and that's where we run into the questions of complexity, because in that solar system and on that planet are things like this and us and so on. But a physicist's view is always searching for underlying laws and principles that can be put into a quantitative, mathematizable, predictive framework. And just going back to what I said, could you have an analog for that in biology? And the answer is, I think, a categorical no, that you can't, because they are highly complex systems, and I don't have time to discuss exactly what I mean by that, but we all know it when we see it, kind of thing. Nevertheless, and that is the point of departure for what I think, at least my collaboration with Jim and the others by extension was to recognize that even though there aren't Newton's laws in the sense that physicists think of them, there are coarse-grained laws, and this has kind of come up in the conversation anyway. Namely, we can, and this was the question actually got me into all of this, we ought to be able to answer that question. We ought to be able to calculate from fundamental principles and from molecular scales, molecular sizes, molecular and universal parameters, why in the hell lifespan of a human being is 100 years, right? And get it, and be able to predict at the same time that a mouse lives just a few years. That ought to be something that biology aims for. And if it doesn't, I go with Darcy Thompson. It ain't a science with a capital S. Okay, and so on. So similar kinds of things. Where in the hell does 8 hours come from for sleep? Why in the hell do mice have so many more tumors than human beings, and whales have almost none? So why in the hell do we do experiments on mice thinking we're learning something about cancer? Well, you want to be able to answer those, and so on. So here's what you guys do, mostly, and I do too. This is what I do. But this is the lens I look at it with. Okay. So when you look at it with that lens, you predict things like this out of a very complicated theory to do with networks and all the other rubbish that goes into it. You predict this kind of amazing result that despite the complexity and complicatedness of the theory, you can predict the number of trees in a forest versus the trunk diameter. This is one of your early graphs, I think. I don't know if it ever appeared in a paper like this, maybe it did. Anyway, that it goes as an inverse square. And not only is that amazing, I think, but you can see it's time invariant, basically. That even though there's tremendous turnover of individuals, there is a constraint that the forest overall, on the average, in a coarse-grained way, obeys this average law, and this is nearest neighbor distance, and so on. This is Brian's putting it together in some of his papers, our papers, who now knows. This is something that I really like. It's work that isn't with Brian or Jim or the other, but it's with a couple of other people that came out of physics. But it was taking that whole theory applied to trees and forests and saying, what happens now if you tell me how much rainfall there is, what the ambient temperature is, etc., etc. What are the meteorological conditions? Can I predict the height of the tallest tree wherever it is in the United States? That's the prediction, and this is the data, and it's pretty good. So that gives you a potential point of departure for understanding not just the ecology, the ecological effects of the external parameters, but also questions of global warming. I'm going to spend just a few minutes, and then I will finish up, I hope. Because one of the things that underlies this, I think, of our work, and Brian talked a little bit about its relationship to natural selection, and I'm going to say a few words in a moment, is that I think one of the most extraordinary things about life is that it is scalable. That it scales from subcellular levels through multicellular to ecosystem levels, using the same physics and chemistry and organizational principles. I mean, that's kind of amazing. And you could not have the resilience of life, you couldn't have life lasting for several billion years unless it were scalable. It couldn't evolve, it couldn't grow, and as I've already said, it could not be resilient, and this is the classic example. This is a slide I actually got from Jim. So there's this extraordinary scalability, and the scaling laws. Did I do the next graph? No. Even further. Yes. The famous scaling law. I found when I came as a physicist to this, so what was I told? The only law in biology is natural selection. Now, I understood natural selection to mean something about historical contingency, that each part of each one of these animals has evolved with its own from its own phylogenetic tree, with environmental niches and so on and so forth, all depending upon very specific history. Well, if that's the case, if you plot metabolic rate versus mass, it should be all over the map, all over the place. So I found this extraordinary, and I thought that this must be something that is central to biology. And discovered it was somewhere, you know, I don't know, rarely could you find it in any book, except at that time, you know, there were 3 well-known books actually had published to summarize the data, but it wasn't a central part of biology. But I find this extraordinary, that despite natural selection and historical contingency, everything lines up the same way on a log-log plot, and that the slope of this is not 1, because the default clearly ought to be that if you double the size of an organism, you double the number of cells, you double the amount of energy you need to stay alive. That's the default. It should be linear. No sense of linearity. There is a stupid, an extraordinarily stupid, in my opinion, argument that it should be 2/3. I find that extraordinary if you believe in natural selection. What in the hell is optimizing fitness about 2/3? So biologists are talking out one side of their mouth about fitness, and then out of the other side of their mouth saying something about surface area to volume and so on, like a Galilean physicist. So, the other thing, may I say, that has already been said, there's an extraordinary economy of scale being expressed here. Okay, so there it is. And incidentally, one of the nice pieces of work that we did with Woody Woodruff was extending that line. That is drawn in to be 3/4, going down to the cellular level. So the same scaling law applies over 27 orders of magnitude. It's kind of installed plants and trees, blah, blah. You've seen all this, and it holds true. And this hasn't been expressed, but I'm sure all of you know it. There are maybe 50 such scaling laws. Here's heart rate, white matter to gray matter, genome length, lifespan, etc. The invariance of the number of times that ATP is produced, radius of the aorta, body length, and so it goes. So this is amazing. So, you know, it says that something, as Brian said, Darwin himself recognized, but everybody forgot afterwards, something is constraining the evolutionary process of natural selection. So in my mind it was that if you jump, you don't need a gene to tell you to come down. Okay? No, it's not a non-trivial point. There is a physical phenomenon that is putting, you don't need to program that in. It's going to happen automatically. So something is automatically going on here that is constraining all of this. So all of that is the stuff you've heard about, and we decided that what is the one thing that transcends everything in biology? It's networks. Everything is sustained by networks, transportation networks, resource networks, informational networks, structural networks, and it is the universal properties of these networks that are the ones that do. And here's, I found an old transparency of mine that I put on, which actually says what they are, and you notice I've written in purple up there what Brian was saying. Derived, they don't necessarily have to be, but the idea is they come from natural selection. Things like these networks have to be space-filling, they have to optimize, which is the third one, and so on and so forth. And from that, you have to put that into mathematics. That was the idea, because that's one of the networks. And I'm not going to go through this, I'm going to slip through, because I've just a couple of things I want to show that weren't shown. Oh, this is what I did want to show, that there is mathematics. There it is, all of it. There it goes. There it goes. And I'll miss this out. There's all the predictions. Loads and loads of predictions. Hundreds of them. Marvelous stuff. But I wanted to show one or two things and I will finish. First is, one of the things also I think that surprised us, maybe, when we thought about it, was that this said that the metabolic rate of a cell in vivo decreases as mass to the 1/4. Here's a little cartoon of it. There it is there. Now that's surprising because the same cell in an elephant is behaving differently than it is in a shrew, than it is in a whale. That's kind of weird. Well, only it is weird unless you get the network picture, because it's what this says is, and this is what it predicts, the network is controlling the cells. And I think you emphasized that, is controlling the cells. So it's completely anti-reductionistic, which says that if I remove the network, the cells that were behaving differently across 8 orders of magnitude now all migrate to the same number, and that's what this cartoon is supposed to show. This should be log BC versus log. Okay. So they should all migrate to the same value. So here was the, there's the data, that's the in vivo versus in vitro, and the data is from Brown et al., but not this Brown, I'm afraid, sorry. And that's the red, because what happens, these are points that our colleague Woody Woodruff got from the literature, and these were dedicated experiments. And he said it's very good, but it's a real, I consider this one of the more powerful predictions of the theory, because the rest is confirming stuff that's already been measured. Okay. Last thing, growth, because it was not talked about, and I think this is really important, is growth. How does it work? It was mentioned in Wen Yun's talk, but I just want to show it. How does it work? What she talked about is you eat, you metabolize, you distribute through the network, some maintains what's there, replaces dead cells, grows new ones, you write down a bunch of equations that says all that, and you make predictions, and here's the predictions. This is, and it has, in principle, universal parameters that give this. So for very different organisms, fish, birds, mammals, and so on. And what was beautiful about it is that you can write this in a dimensionless form inspired by the theory. The theory tells you if you plot it in this way, where this is kind of a universal parameter effectively, then you get a universal curve. Everybody grows in the same way if you look at it properly. And going to the ant data that you showed, which is from, where is he? Where's my, he left, he ran away. There he is, Chen, with Jamie. There it is. They showed with colonies and for the beasts themselves, they follow the same kind of curve. And then, more recently, with Van and Alex, I've lost Van, there's that same graph as we had for the organisms, but put on here tumors. There's a whole theory of tumors that we developed, which is another test of the theory. Oh, there it is. Another test of the theory, because you take the network of healthy tissue, the body, and then you ask, satisfying these network principles, and you ask yourself, what happens if I start growing something on it that also tries to satisfy those principles? What happens? And you can get a whole theory of tumor growth, tumor metabolism, and so on and so forth. So I will finish there and simply reiterate again, I probably shouldn't have said any of the science, because the only thing I really want to say is thank you, Jim. It's been wonderful. I was looking at Astrid there, and I've often thought, I know this sounds totally perverse, but I consider the relationship with Jim a little bit like a marriage. It was a commitment. No, I mean this seriously, and I'm going to take a minute on this, because he was running this big group, Portal. I didn't know where the hell Portal was. I still don't, actually. But anyway, there's all this junk going on down there, and I'm running this high energy physics up there. To take out even a few hours was a big commitment. And we both actually ended up taking out effectively a whole day, a Friday, and Jim would drive up mostly with Brian and so forth. And that was an extraordinary commitment. And I must tell you, many times I came away from those conversations saying, what in the fuck am I doing talking to these guys? They don't understand any of these equations, drive me nuts. And no doubt they felt the same way, just like a marriage. So thank you, Jim, and thank you, Astrid, for letting it be part of my life. Good.